All right, hello everyone, and welcome to an intro to Italian horror. Potentially the wildest genre, one of the wilder places where you can find horror. It was really a place where rules were being broken, boundaries were being pushed, in some cases because they just jumped on the certain trends and decided to go a little further. But there are some of these movies I could watch all day. And Todd and I have referenced them in a number of different programs and talked about them. And we figured, let's finally do an actual program just about Italian horror itself. I'm seeing a couple new people in here, so I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Liz. I'm the reference librarian / adult programming coordinator at the Derry Public Library. And Todd, do you want to introduce yourself a bit?
So I am usually Liz's designated co-host / bouncer at the door, medical biller by day. I don't know what to call it by night at this point.
Well, you're an actor. You're in
Some
plays
of the
now.
time, some of the time. And 1 month of the year, she lets me run a topic here. You might have been here for the August presentation on David Lynch. We're still ironing out what next year's is going to be.
Yeah. But we're both amateur. Well, we took film classes in college. Todd, I think you actually majored or minored in film.
Concentration under my English major.
Okay. Yeah. I took a number of film classes. I don't think I took enough to actually minor because I had to focus on my major, but we're both almost lifelong film nerds and definitely amateur film people. And once a month, Eric lets me talk about a topic I find incredibly interesting in film. And you can find all of our past programs archived on the Derry Public Library's YouTube page. But with that, let's get into why we're all here, which is the weird, wonderful, in some cases beautiful world of Italian horror. There we are. All right. So you're going to probably ask, what do you mean when you say Italian horror? And of course, what am I getting myself into with what you've heard me? If you came in early enough, you heard Todd and I talking about a director who got called into court to prove he didn't murder his actors. So we're in for an interesting time. But unlike certain other places where there seems to be like a very specific style, I would say Japan is a place where Japanese horror has some real hallmarks that are very specific to that culture. I would also say like South American as well is one where the more I've watched it, the more I'm like, oh, you can definitely see like there's certain types of stories and themes that come back. You don't quite see that in Italy. And in the book Italian Horror Cinema, some of the authors actually argued that because Italian horror, especially in the 70s and 80s, didn't really have a house style, so to speak, or a lot of national signifiers, that kind of set it apart in and of itself. Even America, which is a melting pot, there are things where you can just kind of go like, well, that's an American horror movie. And oddly enough, Italy started jumping on what America was doing, particularly in the 70s into the 80s. I think it can really be argued in the 60s, Italy had a style with the Giallos, but as as time went on, as globalization opened up entertainment and brought new stuff over, stuff changed. So, how will you know you're watching an Italian horror movie? Well, in a lot of cases, they're very, very colorful. The aesthetics of Italian horror, I almost don't think are rivaled. I mean, again, maybe Japan, but even that, I would say Italy comes out on top. You can also see these films where they look beautiful, they're impeccably made, or they look like the image on top, like they were made for $5. It is a consistent battle between looking good and looking cheap, kind of like a John Waters movie. The plot is kind of incoherent. This is something we see more in some of Lucio Fulci's films, and as we're getting into the 80s, where the movies became more about set pieces than an actual plot. The blood is always day glow red. I kid you not, if you've ever seen Dario Argento's Suspiria, you will know what I mean. The murders are elaborate. And Todd, would you like to expand on what I mean by an elaborate murder?
Well, I mean, probably the most famous examples coming to mind would be, in the least spoiler rate possible, the opening kill of Dario Argento's Suspiria, which is, I suppose you could call this a great example of rule of threes because it involves a knife to the heart, a noose, and falling through a giant plate glass window.
A beautiful plate glass window too. It's art directed within an inch of its life. And actually inspired, as we'll get into this, inspired a lot of other films and filmmakers. And also great soundtracks. I gotta say, some of my favorite scores and soundtracks of all time are from Italian horror films. Again, I'm going to keep harping on it, but Suspiria, the Goblin soundtrack for Suspiria is great. Also, the works of Fabio Fabrizzi, his work for The Beyond, beautiful.
Yeah. Also, I got to give a shout out Keith Emerson's score to Inferno. Yes, Keith Emerson, Lake and Palmer fame.
Yes. Also, despite the title, Cannibal Holocaust has a very chill opening theme.
It is surprising how relaxing that main theme is.
It is. You're like, oh, am I going on a cruise? Is this just gonna be about like people sailing down the Amazon or something? No, it's not. It's horrifying. But man, so it's one where just taken on its own, like this is great. But yeah. Italian horror, especially late 70s into the 80s, just peak in terms of film scores. So you've heard me mention this term. Why do I keep hearing the term giallo? And this is what I would say is when Italy did kind of have a house style for its horror films. So giallo, not all Italian films are giallo, but giallo is an Italian term, and it specifically means these noirish murder mysteries. There's usually a serial killer. There's usually a woman in peril. The serial killer is usually wearing gloves. If you are a fan of Dario Argento, you probably know that he is usually the man wearing the gloves during the kills. This still is from Blood and Black Lace, where it is, oh no, models are being murdered in very beautiful, elaborate ways. They're inspired by the noir films of the 40s. A lot of inspiration came from Hitchcock, but as we're getting into the late 60s, early 70s, and films, even mainstream films, were starting to become a little bit more explicit in terms of what they could show. And if you remember back a few years when I did my exploitation cinema program, that was kind of the launching pad for it. The idea of violence in film, sexuality in film, that got its start with the exploitation movies that were not mainstream, but they eventually bled into it. We had that. Oh wow, lost my train of thought. So we had the violence of these more kind of gritty, off the beaten path movies finding their way into mainstream films. I mean, this might be shocking to hear now, but Psycho, for its time, was considered a very violent film because of what happened for mainstream audiences. And some of the stuff in giallos were also considered very shocking. Kind of what I said earlier about the plot doesn't make sense. The plots in giallos are certainly better than something like Fulci's The Beyond or Demons, which is a very basic plot, but still there is an emphasis on style, on aesthetic over.
So it's actually, on your note about things making sense, I was a little surprised by this. If you want to do some additional research on this genre, there is a documentary on Tubi called All the Colors of Giallo, where they talked about what are the rules is. When you come out of a giallo, the story has to still all make sense. Like, you look back and afterwards go, all the pieces are there. Everything adds up.
Yeah. It's a little discombobulated when you watch it. Like Bird with Crystal Plumage can kind of be like that, but same with Lizard and Women's Skin. But it's one where if you were to watch it again and think about it, you're like, oh, okay, it all fits. The same cannot be said for some other films that we will discuss. And giallos have had a long influence on American or filmmakers and well, actually no, Edgar Wright's not American, but if you saw Malignant from 2019, that definitely had a lot of giallo influence, especially in terms of the use of color. Brian De Palma's Dressed to Kill, he has said himself, really inspired by the giallos of the 60s. I think a really underseen film, it's not talked about as much, but Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho. Also with its use of color and also its use of like the murder mystery. The supernatural aspect is a little iffy. Usually giallos tended to focus a bit more on, how should I say, earthbound things. But there is a lot in Last Night at Soho, which if you've watched giallos, you're like, oh, I see what Edgar Wright is doing there. But they're a lot of fun, and I would say if you want a good kind of murder mystery that's got a little bit of style to it, they're a really good watch, and again, a really good intro, especially the ones in the 60s. But as we go on, it starts to get a little schlockier. And of course, that's when I really started to fall in love. So as I was saying earlier, as broadcast television in a more global film market started to open up, Italy started to get more American movies. And if you have knowledge of film history, America and Italy and it kind of borrowed from each other a lot. There was the spaghetti westerns where American directors would go over and make westerns in Italy. And then, some of them were inspired by Japanese films. The history of world cinema is really a lot about borrowing and inspiration. I don't like to use the term stealing. Art is all about being inspired by something, and as long as you can take that and make your own thing, I think that's cool, and I think that's great. I mean, for real, there's only, 6 real stories on the planet, and we all just keep reworking them. Sorry.
Give or take, depending what school of thought you go with.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's a discourse I have been seeing from people like, oh, the Magnificent Seven ripped off the Seven Samurai. And I'm like, no, most of the people who worked on that movie were like, oh yeah, we saw this Japanese samurai film and we said, let's rework this as a Western. I mean, isn't that what remakes are supposed to do? Do your own thing. You're not copying it. Anyway, tangent, but new films and new genres and new styles came to Italy. Namely stuff like zombie films came over. And that's when the zombie craze of the late 70s, early 80s got kicked off. But in the Italian film industry, it went from what's the story to what movie are you ripping off? And if you're a fan of the podcast 80s All Over, Drew McQueenie, one of the hosts, talked about that a lot when he discussed the Italian movies that we would eventually get over here. And this didn't just apply to horror. So Conan the Barbarian's success gave us Ator. If you're a Mystery Science Theater fan, you might remember that film. And Thor and Gunan, Mad Max and the Warriors gave us Escape from the Warriors of the Wasteland / the Bronx Warriors. These movies also had like 3 different titles. And again, zombies became a really big thing. George Romero rewrote the book on zombies with Night of the Living Dead, but it really didn't start to become a bigger phenomenon until Dawn of the Dead came out 10 years later. And it didn't really become a phenomenon in the United States. It became a phenomenon in Italy. They loved the zombie stuff. In fact, Fulci's Zombie was called Zombie 2 because Dawn of the Dead was known as Zombie over there. So they're like, let's just capitalize on this. And again, this is something that the film industry in multiple countries have been doing forever. I mean, I definitely think the remake, reboot thing is getting worse now, but it is still something where it's like, this is just something that the film industry has been doing for a while because known intellectual properties or known ideas tend to translate into easy money, or at the very least, they are seen as a less risky investment. And as Todd said earlier, zombie movies were something you could do for cheap, and you really didn't have to get any known actors for it. Not that there were many known actors in some of those movies anyway.
You got like Mia Farrow's sister, and that was probably the biggest get for a couple of these.
Yeah. Mia Farrow has a sister, and she acts, and her most famous film is Lucio Fulci's Zombie.
Speaking of, do we get on a final count as on the number of films that have borne the larger quote unquote zombie franchise moniker? I think they're up to at least 5.
At least 5. Lucio Fulci did not have much to do with him afterwards. starting in the, we'll discuss this later. He made movies but started to bow out due to health reasons. But I wanted to include this quote from Italian horror cinema. These films are exemplars not only for their ability to hide their national belonging. Again, there's no real national signifiers for Italian cinema other than like some stylistic choices. There's nothing seen as Italian. But as with other imitation films, they cope with their budgetary limitations in their respect to the originals as through a strong accent on exoticism and graphic violence. And that's another thing they would do with these, these what movies are you ripping off? They're like, well, we'll take this idea and we'll up the ante. Dawn of the Dead had that the decapitation with the helicopter. Well, wait till you see what we do here. And speaking of which, gore and Italian horror cinematic partnership. The image that you are looking at is from City of the Living Dead. This is a scene where a woman is in. What's the story with this? Were they infected by demons or something? I've seen this movie and I don't know.
I want to say the official storyline on that is a curse.
Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, Fulci's movies in particular get real touch and go with the plot in terms of like, wait, what's this again? But the woman is cursed and is vomiting out her entire intestines. Now, the way this was done was they had the woman put sheep intestines in her mouth and spit them up. I really hope her pay was good, but probably not. However, what they did for a bulk of the shoot, because there's only so much a human can spit up if they have something in their mouth, is they made a bust of her head and they're actually feeding it through. And actually, it's a really good model, but Todd, you compared this to another scene in a Fulci film where you can kind of see like, okay, this is where it's now a bust of a head rather than a real person.
So, and I'm just going to put this larger note as a context thing. This is a part of a series of 3 movies Fulci did called the Gates of Hell trilogy. Mm-hmm. These films, as we established, they aren't really plot heavy. They're a bit more of a vibe type of thing. The Beyond in particular it almost breaks out like little vignettes. There is a word involving a scene where a man is basically attacked by tarantulas. And if you watch it shot for shot, you can kind of see where it's the actual actor with like either safe spiders or prop spiders on his face. And when they have just a prop head, they let the spiders go wild on him.
I mean, I gotta say, credit to Fulci. No one who worked with him ever talked about like, oh, he was really reckless on set. Meanwhile, Bertolucci is making Last Tango in Paris and traumatizing the female star. So who's the real monster here, I guess, is my question. But yeah, it's one of the reasons Italian horror was so graphic was, and we'll discuss this a little later, is the mondo genre was kind of big. And also, again, movies were just getting a little bit more explicit and a little more violent. And this was, how do we set ourselves apart from what other people are doing? We're going to up the ante. There was also an aspect of, oh, if we get banned in the UK or banned in other countries, there's extra notoriety. We can sell this really well in American video stores, or this can play at cinemas because it's like, oh, a movie they don't want you to see. It was almost a marketing tool for some of them. And if you are not familiar with why stuff got banned in the UK in the 80s, there was the whole video nasty panic. This is actually appropriate. I'm talking about this during Banned Books Week. There were some, moral guardians who were convinced that violent movies were going to turn children into violent hooligans. Instead of, I don't know, sitting down and talking with kids about how movies aren't real, they decided to ban these films, give them more notoriety, and then kids would go and seek them out. So great job, everyone. Actually, in the UK, it was fairly draconian. They would actually employ censors who would go through films and cut stuff out. It's I actually talked about this a few years ago in my film censorship program. But for Italy, it almost became a dare of who can do the grossest thing and, get the most attention. And speaking of gross things, here we are. Other than zombies being a big craze for Italian horror, they really liked cannibals in the 70s and 80s. Like, I think they did cannibal stuff more than any other country doing horror. It was, well, South America, maybe. I don't know. I don't think South America really did that much. In America, we really mainly did that with like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of stuff, but not to the extent that Italy did it. We're going to a remote country in South America. Oh no, we've encountered a cannibal tribe.
Yeah, America, it's always more the idea of, for lack of a way to put it, it's like a spin-off of redneck horror for the most part.
Yeah.
Occasionally you get like weird offshoots like Eating Raoul, but generally it was more like it became part of like exploitation.
Yeah. It's this, I think, more than any other part of Italian horror is I will just say, aggressively not for everyone. It's not even a genre I really go to a lot, other than like one or two titles. But why was it so big? Well, other than it's a way to do notoriety, it's also it's easy to do. Again, cannibalism is just a taboo that people are interested in, so you don't have to cast well-known actors. You can just get some people, and this movie will likely make a profit. Not to mention, this was in the middle of just like the exploitation craze. It's also a really easy way to get nudity, and that was always something that Italian horror was looking for. It's like, how can we get some nudity here? But if you're familiar with the Mondo genre, Mondo Cane being probably the title everyone has heard of, those were films that came out. That one came out in 62 or 63, but it was a pseudo documentary that showcased like different, quote unquote, different cultures, stuff that was shocking, stuff that was taboo. The real heir to that was the Faces of Death series, but the inspiration definitely found its way into the cannibal films of the Italian horror genre. So Umberto Lenzi is a big name in the cannibal genre. He did Make Them Die Slowly, which is a great name for just any movie. He did Man from Deep River. He did Eaten Alive. But the big one is Cannibal Holocaust. And Todd, considering you have talked to director Roberto Deodato, which, rest in peace, would you like to explain the Cannibal Holocaust controversy?
So there are actually two controversies here. And actually, I will say before I go into
one we're going to save for later.
Because I'm not seeing the slide, I need to give a shout out. The Derry Public Library, the novel We Eat Our Own by Kia Wilson, is unsubtly inspired by the production of Cannibal Holocaust. She openly acknowledges as such at the end of the book. It's an interesting read to kind of give you a sense of what the conditions making these types of films usually were. But as far as this note goes here, Deodato did something which nowadays it's seen as kind of commonplace. At the time, he was ahead of the curve on. He decided he was going to actually kind of spin this to make people think this is a real story. So he actually had a rider in the contracts for the actors, which was basically like, for a period of time after the movie comes out, you cannot talk to the press. You will go completely off the grid. We want to make it seem like you literally were this person who got murdered in this film. If this sounds familiar, they tried a similar marketing trick with the Blair Witch Project in 1999. But here's the problem. When the Blair Witch people did it, it was a supernatural threat, so obviously on some level we all had in the back pocket, okay, this didn't actually happen. Cannibal Holocaust, the actors who supposedly where this actually happened, are shown on screen being viciously, violently dismembered in some fairly graphic ways. So the Italian authorities saw this and looked and went, this guy made a snuff film. They took him to court, ready to try this man for murder for some of the things that were depicted on the film. And at the time, he's looking, going, "No, I didn't kill these people, but I can't just bring them in here right now." And he is in the press, and they obviously they're all looking at, because they're contracts, they can't come up and go, "No, I'm fine." Eventually, he finally just had to reach out and go, "I am voiding that part of your conflict out of your contract. Please come in here and tell these people how I didn't murder you."
Yeah, I mean, that is not the first time an Italian director was taken to court, but again, we will talk about this later. It's a Yeah, again, there's a reason that later in the slide I put this in Cannibal Holocaust and Italian Horror 103. And also keep in mind, like, it's not as when you talked about Blair Witch Project being a supernatural threat versus cannibalism, it is not as if cannibal tribes do not exist. Now, granted, even in those tribes, cannibalism in its practice is extremely rare. It's usually between warring tribes, or if an elder has died, they're not just going to pick people off and eat them.
Oh yeah.
But was this pre or post? What was that? One of the Rockefeller kids who went to New Guinea and never came back.
Oh geez, I can't remember. Although I will say, per your point, that is, at the risk of minor spoiler, that is kind of the big twist of Cannibal Holocaust. Is they make it seem like it is just okay, these people just got randomly ran afoul of a tribe and got killed. And as the movie goes on, you start to find out, no, these weren't innocent babes in the woods. They basically threw rocks at a hornet's nest and got a whole bunch of stingers for it.
So it is an exploitation film that actually has something to say, but it's also strange because it's an exploitation film kind of pointing the finger at exploitation.
Yeah.
I mean, look, moral consistency is not something we always find in film. Like, we have to just accept that.
I believe that's what they call the war movie dilemma.
Yeah. But I would say of all the cannibal movies to watch, I'd probably say Cannibal Holocaust is the one, maybe Man from Deep River. But if you I got it, like, Eaten Alive and Cannibal Ferox are very rough films. I mean, I already said you're gonna expect gore. There's also going to be a lot of violence against women. If you do not like to watch that, you may just want to avoid this genre altogether. There's also violence of another kind, which we will get to at the end of this program. But let's get to the Italian horror Mount Rushmore, which is we did this with our body horror thing last year, the four patron saints. Let's talk about the four patron saints of Italian horror. So first off are the Bavas. So this is a family where it's three generations of filmmakers. So the first is Mario Bava. He is probably, if you've heard any Bava name, it's Mario. He is the father of modern Italian horror with Black Sunday. But he, like a lot of directors who work in Italian horror, they're not exclusive to horror. He actually got his start. He worked in science fiction. He did comedy. He did the Sword and Sandal movies, which, if you don't know what those are, they're kind of like the Hercules films. And then he made Black Sunday. And that really put him into the horror genre. And then he started making a lot of giallos in the 1960s. But his father was Eugenio Bava, who had worked in the film industry beforehand. And then his son, Lamberto, got a start, grew up watching his dad make films. He wanted to be a director as well. He worked on a lot of his dad's films. He also worked on his father's final film, which was Shock in 1997. And sadly, the year that Lamberto Bava makes his debut in 1980 with Macabre, Mario Bava passes away suddenly from a heart attack and at age 65. So bittersweet in that instance. Lamberto Bava is still working on, but he's best known for the rock and roll zombie movie Demons, which we'll get to that later, but gosh, that movie's a lot of fun. So up next is Dario Argento. You've already heard us mention his name. Best known for Suspiria, which one of the most beautiful films ever made. I think it is up there with any quote unquote classier film. He's still alive. He's still making movies. Somewhat controversial opinion. I think he is a far more uneven director than someone like Fulci, even though Fulci's films are a little less artsy, so to speak. Because what did I watch? It was Dark Glasses. Yeah, that's not great. And some of his later work it just doesn't reach the heights of his peak, sadly. But he got a start. He worked with Bernardo Bertolucci. He worked with Sergio Leone. Again, not really doing horror, but just doing whatever he could. If this resembles anything, it's like the people who worked with Roger Corman back in the B movie days, where they're just like, give me any kind of work you can so I can get my feet wet until I eventually find what works for me as a creator. And his partner, Daria Nicolati, she wrote a number of his films, and she's also the mother of his daughter, Asia Argento. He's best known for his use of color in films. Like, if you ever hear someone go like, oh, Italian movies are so colorful, it's likely because they've seen one of Dario Argento's films. And also, he is able to curate fantastic soundtracks for his work. And as I mentioned earlier, if you watch a person being murdered in a Dario Argento film, that is Dario Argento doing the strangling, the stabbing, grabbing that rope. And again, despite my feelings of him having an uneven filmography, I do think of any of the directors here, auteur fits him the most, because you look at his movies, especially the movies he made in the 70s into the early 80s, they're so distinctly him. And that is not something you get with some other directors who were more journeymen, like especially the ones like Bruno Mattei, Umberto Lenzi, Joe D'Amato. They were making whatever they could, and they just happened to make a horror movie. But Argento really seemed to be born to make horror films. And now we're getting on to my man, Lucio Fulci, who looks like a grandpa. If you ever go back and look at pictures of him, even when he was making The Beyond, he just got a beard and glasses. He looks so cuddly. And then you watch his films and you're like, this is the most misleading person I have ever seen in my life.
This man goes for eyes the Zell of all Three Stooges.
Yeah, I don't know what Lucio Fulci has against people having their eyes in their sockets where they belong, but if you watch his films, you are guaranteed to see eye trauma. So if you were like me, just be aware. Eye trauma happens, although one of the things Fulci likes to do with his violence, especially in that aspect, is draw it out. Not so much in that when it happens, but it's almost like he's giving you a warning. It's that anticipation of, oh God, this horrible thing is going to happen. Oh God, it's coming. But it's almost like he's giving you a chance to cover your eyes or leave the room if you want to. But he knows in terms of the violence in his films, it's like he knows what a lot of people's sensitive points are. Like, there are some people like, oh, I can watch a head get chopped off, or I can watch a person get stabbed in the back, but eyes, some more vulnerable parts of our body, are just something we can't handle, and he knows how to really make you squirm. And he is like the godfather of gore in the United States is Herschel Gordon Lewis. But if we're talking Italian horror, I think the godfather of gore is Lucio Fulci. And while he's not as artsy as Argento, he definitely knows how to shoot violence and make it thrilling rather than just disgusting. And again, the Dayglow red paint just keeps running. I love it. On the personal side of his life, Fulci lived a rough life. He was raised by an anti-fascist family, which they were well off enough to where they were shielded from any really bad repercussions during World War II, but it was still kind of a rough go for him when he was younger. He kind of floated around profession-wise before really finding the film industry, but his wife died when he was fairly young. I think it's some of the information I have never been able to verify, but it is rumored that his wife died of suicide. Never really talked about it. There was also talk of one of his daughters got in a car accident that disabled her for a long time. There was also rumors that, I think he had two daughters that we know of, but there were rumors that there was a third daughter that died at a young age. And in the mid-'80s, his health started to fail. He had diabetes and a number of other health complications, and he eventually passed away in 1996, just due to poor health. And it was getting harder and harder for him to make films, but films were how he made money. And, Dario Argento would help him like co-direct some of his later work. But, if you had to have me watch one director's work for the rest of my life, I'm like, ooh, I think I might have to go with Fulci. I love Suspiria, but man, I love a lot of Fulci's work. It's so gleefully trashy. And also it's very weird. It's very vibes. And again, I wanted to just leave it here. His quote, "Violence is Italian art." So now that we've gone over some of the directors you should know, if I'm new to this, what should I watch? Well, don't worry, we're not going to blindside you with Cannibal Ferox. We'll let you know what it is, but we're not going to tell you to watch that as a 101. We're
That would
not
be
monsters.
abuse.
What?
That would be abuse.
Yeah, no, we're not monsters. So as I said, you should probably watch the landmark film for modern Italian horror, and that is Mario Bava's Black Sunday, also known as The Mask of Satan, although if you were to search for it here, it would be under Black Sunday. And if you want a good example of how to convey violence in a film and pain without really seeing blood, one of the opening scene of Black Sunday is a great example of how. And you may have seen this scene referenced a lot in horror, where a witch is being, burned at the stake, but before she's burned, they're putting this mask with nails on her to make her suffer. And you see this executioner pound the mask in. It's black and white. You don't see blood. You don't see gore. You certainly don't see what happened to this poor woman's face. But you hear a groan and you hear that loud gong of that hammer hitting the mask. And you know how painful that must have been. You feel it. It's a superb film. Barbara Steele is just so, number one, just beautiful, but just so good and enigmatic in that movie. She's fantastic. And it's a great witch movie. I'm kind of hoping Coolidge shows it for their horror marathon, considering witches is the theme. And we're going to go on just to another Bava, as I mentioned before, Blood and Black Lace. This one's a lot of fun. It didn't get great reviews when it came out, but it's one of those movies that got reevaluated, and it was appreciated more by foreign audiences than it was in Italy. And the murder scenes in this are incredibly stylized. There's one woman that's being drowned, but there's a shot where you're underwater. You're seeing her face underwater, and she looks almost like a China doll. It's again, extremely stylized in this beauty and violence kind of being joined together. And even Scorsese was a fan of it. He cited it as like a great use of a great example of style, a great example of tension. Also, again, really inventive filming from Bava in terms of how to film these murder scenes. It's not just, well, someone got stabbed. It's how about I shoot this from within the water versus just watching it from the viewpoint of the killer. So if we're going to do with Argento, Bird of Crystal Plumage, which if anyone saw the Jordan Peele film Us from 2019, there is a scene where Elizabeth Moss's character is crawling on the ground and she reaches up. That is almost not shot for shot, but it is very clearly inspired by a shot in this film. And considering Jordan Peele's a horror fan, I'm like, this has to be intentional. So an American expat, he's trying to catch a serial killer. Now he's being pursued by a serial killer. His girlfriend's being pursued by the serial killer. He may or may not be losing his mind. And again, if we're talking about influences, Dario Argento watched stuff like Blood and Black Lace and is like, okay, I want to do that, but how can I do that with my own style? So it's not imitation, it's inspiration. And Ennio Morricone, the great musician, you've probably heard from him in either his great score for The Thing, or he sampled a lot in Quentin Tarantino's films. But this was the movie that really brought Argento to prominence, not only in the Italian scene, but as it was going overseas, when it eventually made the rounds to like the US and other countries, people were like, oh, who is this guy? This guy's got style. But if you really have to watch one Argento film, and I think this might be as much as I love Fulci, I do think this is the best Italian horror film ever made. It's the 1977 Suspiria. And as I said earlier, one of the most beautiful films ever put to screen. Art directed within an inch of its life, but you could, I just love looking at stills of this movie. I remember seeing this in college, and I had seen Technicolor in film. I'd seen some Douglas Sirk movies. The way Yasujiro Ozu used color in some of his later films was also like, gorgeous. The Color of Pomegranates is a beautiful film. But seeing color like that, I had yet to see, at least in a live action film. It's beautiful. And it's also another one where it's like, the movie kind of makes sense, sort of. I mean, it's coherent enough, but the dialogue is funny because when Argento initially envisioned this film, which is about an American dance student going to a German dance school and it's run by witches, and half the actors are Italian, there's a lot of dubbing in this movie, you can definitely tell. He envisioned the characters being younger, like 12, 13, 14. And studios would not go for that, which if you look at the second image, you can see why. I don't think a lot of people want to watch a 12-year-old getting stabbed. I don't think any sane person does. But he never changed the dialogue for the film. So there are certain scenes where you're watching these two like 20-something women talk to each other like 12-year-olds, and there's a lot of great humor that comes from that. But it is the Goblin soundtrack I mentioned before is great. It's definitely the best of the Three Mothers trilogy, by a mile. Inferno is worth it, although Todd, you saw Mother of Tears. Todd, how is Mother of Tears?
Actually, gonna be perfectly honest, I have not yet watched Mother of Tears, but
Oh,
I have yet to hear anybody defend that movie.
okay. I thought you'd watch that one. Well,
No,
maybe
it
that's
wasn't
why
a
I didn't watch it.
The Three Mothers trilogy has been one I have circled for doing a franchise deep dive a few years now. I almost considered this year, but number one, we're already seeing the Witch Marathon later this month for Suspiria, and two, I just want to treat myself to some Fulci.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I have yet to hear anything good about Mother of Tears. And again, as much as I like Argento, it really feels like his later work is just not great. But there was a remake in 2018, and I don't know how controversial an opinion this is. I really like the remake. It's not the 1977 Suspiria, but it's not trying to be. It's just basically taking the general plot idea and doing something different with it, to the point where Luca Guadagnino, he actually did the exact opposite in terms of a color palette. The color palette for 2018 Suspiria is a lot of muted colors, a lot of muted beiges, grays, muted reds, because he did not want to be compared to this movie at all. I think they're both good. I say you watch a double feature of them and compare and contrast. And now, I still remember being 10 years old, going to my local video rental place, rest in peace, Advanced Video, and seeing the VHS cover to this film, where it's just that zombie and that tagline, and wanting to watch it. And my mother rightfully deciding that, no, a 10-year-old shouldn't see this. But it was enough for me to go, one of these days, I'm going to watch this film. And I did, and I love it. It's still one of my favorites. So as I mentioned earlier, this was called Zombie, or marketed as Zombie 2 in Italy to kind of capitalize off the popularity of Dawn of the Dead. Also called Zombie Flesh Eaters, another great title. So Mia Farrow's sister, she is not Mia Farrow's sister in the movie, but the actress is Mia Farrow's sister. And I think other than this and Anthropophagus, these are the biggest movies she's done. A boat, her dad's boat turns up in a harbor without her dad. And so she goes to a tiny remote island in the Caribbean looking for him. And oh no, zombies are there. Why are there zombies here? We don't know. The island's cursed or something. There's zombies conquistadors. This is a thing you find in a lot of Fulci horror movies, where it's just like, why is this happening? We don't really know. It just is. Roll with it. But that's part of the fun. And there's also an amazing scene in this film where a zombie fights a shark. And I wish I could show it, but there's nudity in it, so I can't. But it is one of the greatest scenes ever put to celluloid. This is what Scorsese was talking about when he said this is cinema. Okay, probably not, but I'd
like to believe he has at least some appreciation for the scrappy, can-do nature of Italians in horror cinema.
He probably does. He wouldn't call it cinema though. He's just like, oh no, this is just fun. But yeah, it's a ton of fun. It's a good thrill ride. It's also, a lot of the zombies, at least in American films, it's mainly like, oh no, zombies in cities or zombies in a remote house. This is zombies in the Caribbean, and it goes a little bit more to like kind of the origins of zombies, which are not the living dead as much as they are people who were cursed. And if we're going back into real zombie lore, they weren't even really dead. They just had their soul stolen. But it kind of mixes both the new zombie stuff and the old zombie stuff. So if you are a zombie fan, it's worth it for that as well. And there are a lot of great zombie moments and some great zombie kills too. And great soundtrack. And Fulci's The Beyond, a movie that makes the barest of sense, but it's still a great watch. There are a lot of good set pieces. It's got a really weird vibe. And Fulci wanted more of a Lovecraft vibe for this. And there are zombies in this, but they were added by the studio. They're like, hey, give us zombies. People liked that. And he's like, okay, fine, I guess.
This might actually be my favorite Italian horror film. I will recognize Suspiria as the better made movie, but this it scratches a special itch for me.
It is. It's very... We joked earlier that some of Italian horror, it's all about the vibes. This is a very good example of it's all about the vibes, man. Because I've watched this movie multiple times. It really doesn't make much sense, but those moments there are moments that still hit. The gory stuff still works. The scary stuff still works. The ending is still haunting.
I'm still convinced that John Carpenter was inspired by this when he made Prince of Darkness.
Oh, probably. It's John Carpenter. The Fabio Frizzi score is amazing. It really, and again, if you actually want to look at it as a Lovecraft story, it works really well. If you want to look at it as a coherent, like, zombie narrative, it doesn't work at all. But if you're looking at it as this woman bought a hotel that just is an eldritch horror, it kind of works a little better. And Catriona McCool, she is in this, all three of the Gates of Hell trilogy. She's in this, City of the Living Dead, and House by the Cemetery. If I had to rank them, it's Beyond, City of the Living Dead, and then House by the Cemetery. I mean, yeah. But City of the Living Dead's a lot of fun too. But the Beyond is just, there's almost an experimental quality to it that I really admire.
It's also got probably one of the best final scenes of an Italian horror film.
Oh, it is. It's haunting. It's really creepy. And if there is something I like about these movies is, yeah, they don't explain much. And where a lot of things are almost over-explained in film now, or you look on YouTube and there's like ending of X explained. It's like the fact that you really can explain this movie. It's just, this is what you're thrown into. It's something where maybe it's a nostalgia or something I have where it's like, oh, I have so much of this today. I'd rather have some ambiguity. But it's definitely, I would say, worth a watch. But just be aware, do not expect anything coherent. Now it's coherent because of how simple it is. There's a free movie screening. There's demons are popping off the screen and they're infecting people, and it goes from there. There's a lot of great action set pieces in it. The creature effects in this movie are great. It's not Rob Bottin's The Thing level, but the makeup and practical effects for this movie are incredibly underrated in terms of how good they are. Todd, I thought you said something.
I actually had not, sorry.
Oh, sorry. But yeah, it also, again, a lot of Italian horror didn't actually take place in Italy. Like Suspiria takes place in Germany. Zombie is in like the Caribbean. The Beyond is in Louisiana. This is Germany again. So it's shot on location in Berlin, although it doesn't really make too much use of the actual outside location. It's mostly within a theater. And again, it's how does this infection start? I don't know. Someone put on a mask. There was a dude in a mask handing out tickets. Why? We don't know. We don't care. You're here for the demons.
And there's that weird idea, like the movie is basically, it's kind of explaining it as it goes in a weird sort of meta way.
Yeah. And then it kind of goes into the tropes we now know of as like the zombie apocalypse tropes. But there is an extra layer of like horror where it's like, oh no, if you're infected, if you become a demon, you're damned for eternity, even though you didn't choose this. So I'm like, oh, that's an extra level of awful. You really don't want to get infected now, but even a small scratch is like, that's it, you're done. It only depends on how long it's going to take for you to be infected. Another great final scene in this, which we're not going to spoil. There's also a moment in this movie, which we have a friend, he's not big on horror, but we showed him demons, and there's a moment that involves a helicopter where he just burst out laughing, and he's just like, I don't know what's happening, but I love this. And that's kind of what Demons is meant to be. It's a ride. It's an amusement park ride, but it's a ton of fun. And again, great soundtrack that also brings some American artists in, like Billy Idol, Rick Springfield. But it's really great fun. There's a scene where someone rides a bike with a katana, just slicing off demon heads. If you've yet to see this, do so. You're going to have fun. Show it at a party. People are going to have a great time. So, other recommendations. What am I recommending for 102? A lot of the giallos. Some are a little more graphic than others, like Torso is one of those, City of the Living Dead. This will win you a bet. Phenomena, aka Creepers, stars Jennifer Connelly. I think this was pre-Legend, not Legend.
Yeah, I think that
Labyrinth.
I think Phenomena is actually her big screen debut.
Yeah, so if someone wants to say it's I'm gonna double check this. But Todd, why don't you explain some of the movies in Italian Horror 103?
So 103 is where this could be best described as, this is where stuff gets really graphic. As we've established, so there's obviously Cannibal Holocaust we discussed has its controversies attached. Cannibal Ferox was basically like, it's the hold my beer next to Cannibal Holocaust, where Cannibal Holocaust, it's still kind of commentary on the exploitation. Ferox just decides, we're going to lean in hard.
Yeah.
New York Ripper is basically, it's Fulci doing, I don't know if could we technically call it a giallo film? It is.
I think his giallo is, Lizard in a Woman's Skin is closer to giallo. Yeah. New York Ripper is almost him doing stuff like
Maniac.
His take on stuff like Maniac. And it definitely has some charges and accusations of misogyny, although again, there are people who have worked with Fulci. None of them have ever said that he has expressed those views or mistreated them on set. I mean, ultimately I never knew the guy, but I think the more accurate way to look at something like New York Ripper isn't him expressing his own views on women, more him responding and trying to ape a trend. And there's always been a discussion about the treatment of women in horror. No one is treated well in horror, but as I tell people, like, this stuff is everywhere. Horror is not the only place it should be singled out. Yeah.
On that note, do we want to drop the bit of the infamous spoiler about Anthropophagus?
Okay. Well, first of all, I did want to say Jennifer Connelly's debut was technically in Once Upon a Time in America, but it was her debut lead was Phenomena. But yeah, Anthropophagus has a scene. We should just probably warn you. We've warned you about gore. There is a scene involving violence to a pregnant woman, and I think we should just leave it there. Wikipedia. You can go on Wikipedia and read the summary and read what happens, and then decide, do I want to watch this or not?
It's interesting because, like, it's a movie that has this reputation being like this horrifically graphic. Like this was a regular of the video nasties when we were in Britain.
Mhm.
A large chunk of it, it's a very slow burn that is punctuated by some downright audacious scenes of gore, but they're like, yeah, again, they're vignettes in this larger, otherwise kind of slow burn story about being stalked by a cannibalistic serial killer.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of Italian horror of the time. It wasn't just wall to wall 90 minutes of gore. It was slow, 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 slow. Oh, holy crud. Did I just watch that?
Which
And then back to
speaks
it
to the
being slow.
it speaks to the value of a really well made set piece.
Yes. I mean, that scene alone got it banned in multiple countries. Also, for Argento's opera, very stylish film, but if you don't like stuff being done to eyes, you might want to avoid opera. In fact, if you were to look on they put that right on the cover, and I'm like, okay. Also, shout out Cemetery Man. That's a fun, quirky little film. And but it's definitely a 102.
I'm due for a re-up on that. It's been way too long.
Yeah. All right. And you know what? I got to give one more recommendation. This was a movie we found when we were, at home during COVID. We're like, hey, Amazon Prime is a lot of these cheesy, cheap Italian horror movies. Let's watch a bunch. And then we found some of them were kind of boring. And then we found Hell of the Living Dead. And my goodness, what a gift this movie is. Directed by Bruno Mattei, who mainly some of the movies he made in the 70s, they were exploitation films, but they were some more of the erotically tinged exploitation films, which I definitely can't talk about for the DPL. They're also just not my thing, so I haven't really seen them. But this movie was a zombie knockoff. It's 3 different movies stitched together. There's a conspiracy to depopulate the third world in there. There's there's a scene where, like, oh, we need to talk to the tribes people. How are we going to do that? Female star who's a journalist is like, I'm going to strip down, and there's a very long scene of her naked body being painted for tribal makeup, and I'm like, well, yep, we know why you put this in here. Again, nudity for no reason. A zombie kid attacks his parents. Hilariously unconvincing zombie child, as you can see. It is everything you want in one of these cheesy, cheap movies. And by the end of the film, when a main character when a zombie reaches inside of the main character's mouth and crushes their skull from within, and the very obviously fake eyes popped out, I gotta say, a single tear went from my eye, and I said, this is cinema. It became one of my favorite films. It's not art, it's schlock. But
I
schlock,
honestly want I want to see the pitch meetings of this, because when you watch the movie, it feels like they pitched 3 different producers on 3 different types of movie, started shooting, then realized, oh wait, we've got to put all this together. Oh,
and
boy.
that's why I love it. This is a movie that's emblematic of the cheap craziness that I love about Italian horror. It's like I just put this movie up as I love the artsiness of Argento. I love Fulci's just consistent trashiness, but movies like this are just so bad you can't help but love them. There's a scrappy quality to it, and also the zombies aren't even convincing, but there's a charm to it. It's the same reason people like cheap slasher movies. There is a charm. But yeah, it's mainly known here as Hell of the Living Dead. You might find it under Virus. No one stars in it. There's no one of note in this, but it's a ridiculously fun time. You and I had a great time watching this movie. And I'd love to recommend it. Now, to get to some of the things we do need to talk about, one last question: am I going to see animal cruelty if I watch an Italian horror movie? Sadly, yes. I mean, I do just want to, before Todd goes into it, because he knows more about the subject. In film history, animal welfare has not been a concern until fairly recently. Even into the 80s, it was not as big of a concern as it is now. Now, I don't think you'd be able to, clearly, well, you couldn't get away with some of that stuff back then. But if anyone remembers the HBO series Luck, where they had a number of horses die on set, that was enough to cancel the show. But if you were to go back and watch those Cecil B. DeMille films, people died on those sets, extras died. What do you think happened to the animals there? So it is a very sad piece of film history, the mistreatment of animals on set. But very sadly, it is not specific to Italian horror. But I do want to avoid seeing this, framing this as this is a problem that is unique to Italian horror cinema. It is a problem that the film industry across the globe had at the time. But Todd, would you like to talk about the other reason that Ruggero Deodato was hauled into court for cannibal holocaust?
So and this probably did not help the case for did this man murder his cast, was there are several, I suppose the nice way to put it, there are several unsimulated scenes of animal cruelty in that movie. And I'm going to put this in a bit of a context. So a few years back, I actually went to a midnight showing of this movie. I had seen it before. I knew what I was getting into, so I figured, how am I going to get a chance to see this on the big screen? I was part of a minority of people in that theater who had seen this movie before and knew what they were getting into. And credit where it's due, the theater staff did warn people, you are going to see actual scenes of animals being killed in this movie. This is not simulation. We're telling you this now because we don't want to feel like we blindsided you. And some of them were mercifully quick moments. I realize that I don't want to sound like I'm downplaying it, because there's still a couple that are unpleasant to watch. Like there's one, it's a quick one, but because the animal is screaming, I get really uncomfortable watching it as it happens. Yeah. But one of the most infamous is a set piece, which they're already in trouble for the animal slaughter on top of this. There's one they got particular trouble for because I'm pretty sure the tortoise they killed and butchered on camera was part of an endangered species.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Like, that was the one where I bring up the midnight show because that was where you could see groups of people getting up and leaving the theater during that scene. Like, there were people probably like, okay, Nils, that was one where I think that got to be too much for a lot of people. And I just wanted to go like, yeah, I don't blame you. I have seen this before, even I'm having a hard time.
Yeah, and it's
and he is to his credit, Deodato has gone on to admit, like, yeah, I shouldn't have done this. I'm not proud of the movie. It doesn't really benefit the movie in any way.
No, it doesn't. And Lizard in the Woman's Skin, there is a scene where a woman walks in and sees animals being vivisected and tortured, and it's very convincing practical effects, but it was so much that, again, the courts were like, you got to prove this isn't real, and the practical effects person had to come in and go, it's all fake, I swear.
Like, he actually brought props in to vindicate this man from what would have been a 2-year jail sentence.
Yeah, and that is another big content warning I would tell people. Like, if you don't like animal cruelty, definitely avoid the cannibal subgenre as a whole.
Supposedly there is an edit of Cannibal Holocaust that takes out the animal cruelty, although I can't speak to how the validity of that one.
Yeah, but it is one where I would just say, keep an eye out. It is something that happens. Although, I mean, I'll go back and read old Mad Magazine stuff from the 60s, and just animal cruelty is played for laughs in that. So it was just a cultural thing at the time, I guess, where people were just like, eh. But we felt that it would be wrong to do this program and not warn you that animal cruelty is something that you could encounter. So these are films that you might want to avoid, or at the very least walk out of the room if you know it's coming. But yeah, if you don't want to see real animal cruelty, do not watch anything in the cannibal genre. It's, again, we put the cannibal films in 103 for a reason. That's for the real diehards at that point.
Yeah.
But with that, does anyone have any questions? In this, again, it's a weird, sick group of films, but for some reason, I love them. Oh, well, someone said, fun presentation, thank you. Yeah, Todd and I, we looked at this, we're like, we're going to have a lot of fun, especially considering my last program was on the history of Hollywood strikes. And I'm like, well, that was a lot of research. This one, I'm just going to have fun. It is. I think the reason I like it, as I said before, it is this really interesting combination of beauty and violence. And you find that in some Japanese horror as well. More so some of the stuff in like the 60s and 70s than now, but now they've kind of gone like the gore. Japan's gone the gore route. Also, Todd, you might know this. As explicit and over the top as Italian horror can get, has anything been ever flagged by customs the way Guinea Pig was?
Not to my knowledge. Like, I know some of these films have been banned overseas. I don't know if there's anything that's quite like, you'll be arrested if you have this.
Yeah, do yourself a favor. Do not Google Guinea Pig. That's another one. Heard about it, Googled it, haven't seen it. I'm just like, yeah, I don't think I need to watch that in my life. But it is it's definitely, there are some movies I think anyone could watch. I think most people could probably do Suspiria. Definitely most people could do Black Sunday and some of the giallos, especially the earlier ones. You know, Fulci's more of a getting in there, but it's maybe this is just because some of the stuff now has just been, when you hear about horror movies nowadays, it's not grassroots. It's not like, oh, your older brother or some kid at school saying, oh, have you seen this? This movie is crazy. It's these almost astroturfed things like the Terrifier 2, or what we're seeing now with Saw 10, where it's like, oh, this movie's so shocking, people are vomiting in the theater.
Which, when that's not... to be fair, that also has an older tradition, because some of that goes back to like some of the old William Castle stunts. But
yeah, but that's, I don't know.
There was more ingenuity back then.
Yeah, like that was a new thing then versus now. It just seems, I don't know. I guess maybe I'm getting jaded. I'm just too cynical when I see it. But as you were saying earlier, you're like, yeah, Terrifier 2. Call me when you get hauled into court. I do tell people Cannibal Holocaust was the Blair Witch before Blair Witch. Although it's always worth remembering, no movie where people died on camera like that would be released by a major studio. Although I might eat my words, because then I remember Twilight Zone the movie got a major release, and if you know anything about the Vic Morrow segment, that's a yikes.
Which apparently, yeah, that turned up in the Cursed Films documentary series, and I don't think I can watch that.
Yeah. But yeah, does anyone have any questions or like other, recommend or like questions for recommendations or what our personal favorites are? All right. Well, again, if I had to say watch anything like for your ultimate introduction, I might say go with Suspiria. It's a little weird, but it's such a beautiful film. I really want more people to see it outside of the horror realm. I actually donated my DVD copy to this to the library, so you can get it here. If you want something that's a little less for the squeamish, again, Mario Bava's Black Sunday is fantastic. Also, Kill Baby Kill is really good, and so Blood and Black Lace is also pretty great. I always recommend it on movie nights with friends. That's great. Also, but again, as I said earlier, if you want a fun movie to watch with friends, Demons is such a good pick. Everyone is gonna have fun watching it.
Like, it's another word. The sheer audacity is part of what makes it work so well.
It is. It's like Nobuhiko Obayashi's Houseu. We're just, at some point, you decide, I'm going to stop being surprised by what I'm seeing, and I'm just going to roll with what's happening on the screen. And you're going to have fun.
It's one of those movies that I think gets best summed up with a quote from Oxygen Hunger Force. Why would he do that? Why wouldn't he?
Yeah, so next month it is going to be my friend Ellie and I talking about The Room. Oh hi Mark, and of course that means we're going to have to talk about the book The Disaster Artist and the film The Disaster Artist and the whole controversy surrounding that one. And then join us in December for it's Snowed In Cinema. It's gonna be like this, like a more fun program where we're just like, okay, The Shining, The Thing, but what else is there for, you know, good snowy movies? And of course, my mind immediately goes to horror movies, but that's not all that's there. And
they
then
will get a lot of representation. But...
Oh, absolutely. We're horror fans. So also just a quick shout out if you are a big fan of seeing old films on the big screen, and I'm not employed by these people, but the Coolidge Corner Theater every year at the final weekend, they do a 12-hour horror movie marathon from midnight to noon. And their theme this year is witches. The triple feature is Rosemary's Baby, Argento Suspiria, and the Blair Witch Project. They have hinted that House of the Devil is going to be shown. And I'm kind of hoping they can get Black Sunday. I mean, that's my dream, but we shall see. But if you want to see Suspiria on the big screen, there is a chance you're just going to have to really pregame sleep that day.
Oh, yeah. I was almost about to say at the Somerville Theater they're showing Demons, but that's tomorrow night. So that's a little short notice.
It's short notice, but if there are tickets still available, they're showing Demons with live music. It's a lot of fun, but keep your eye on, like, there's the Brattle, Somerville Theater and Coolidge Corner Theater. They tend to show at least like Suspiria and Fulci films on a fairly regular basis. So if you do want a chance to see them on the big screen, keep an eye out. All right. Well, if that is the case, I am going to bid everyone good night and have a very happy Halloween. And if you've never seen some of these films, have fun if you're going to watch them for the first time.